objected to the poster and threatened to sue him. And he said, "Oh, go ahead, I'll sell more posters." And so they quietly withdrew their threats. This depleted uranium has traveled all around the world. And what we're seeing since 1991, when it was introduced to the battlefield by the U.S., is increases in infant mortality globally, which have been reported in the New York Times and the Lancet Medical Journal in Britain and in British newspapers, as well as other countries. Now, infant mortality has been declining since 1963, when the U.S. and Russia signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. So, if infant mortality suddenly began increasing after 1991, then there has to be a new source of radiation, and it has to be an environmental exposure because it's happening all over the world. The problem with depleted uranium is that it is contaminating the troposphere, which is the first 10,000 feet of the atmosphere from the ground. And this is the most dynamic and the highest energy environment or part of the atmosphere, because it's where there are storms and hurricanes and big convection cells and tornadoes. It's very, very dynamic, and so the mixing occurs very quickly, and it's also transported around the world very quickly in just a matter of a couple of weeks. It's actually contaminating the whole global atmosphere, and this increase in infant mortality is like the canary in the coal mine. It's telling us we have a global environmental problem. Other diseases that it is causing are birth defects in the children of the soldiers who come back and their bodies are contaminated with depleted uranium. It's in their semen. They internally contaminate their wives and partners. And then, of course, even if the soldiers had normal babies before they went off to war, they come back and the children, the newborns, the babies born after the exposure, have very severe birth defects. In the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Yugoslavia, mothers now in the hospital don't ask, is it a girl or a boy when their baby is born? They ask instead, is it normal? Other very large increases that we are seeing as a result of this global radiation poisoning is an epidemic of melanoma, that's skin cancer, particularly in children. I believe that diabetes is the most astounding response to the internal depleted uranium exposure, which people around the world, in fact all living things, are being exposed to. And this came to my attention when I was interviewing people who just American citizens who had gone to Iraq in 2003 during and after the Iraq War. And I was quite interested to talk to the wives, for instance, of Iraqi Americans. They had gone, or their husbands had gone, to visit Iraqi family members in Baghdad and discovered their family members living in Iraq were in an epidemic of diabetes. This has also been reported in Qatar and Kuwait, other Middle Eastern countries. And this one wife told me her husband was only in Baghdad for 3 weeks. He came back to the United States, and 2 months later he had diabetes. Well, I began to pursue that, and I informed Dr. Ernest Sternglass, who is on some of my programs and is a co-researcher with me. We're colleagues doing this radiation investigation together. And he began to look at Centers for Disease Control and other U.S. government data. He called me back a week later and he said, "Oh no," he said, "you're absolutely right." He said there are very large increases in diabetes in the Gulf states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and he said that DU is being transported across the Atlantic Ocean in these sand and dust storms, and then because there's very high rainfall along the Gulf Coast, it's being rained out into the environment. And also, he said in Puerto Rico, Vieques Island is where the U.S. Military and British military practiced with DU munitions for decades. And he said, "Oh my goodness, Puerto Rico has the highest rate of diabetes in the United States. It's over 25%. That was just so alarming. And then we began to look at Alaska data, very, very high increases in diabetes since 1991. And there are no nuclear power plants and no radiation sources in Alaska that would cause such a huge increase of diabetes. And then I took Centers for Disease Control data for diabetes from 1980 through 2002. And the truth was in that data. Between 1980 and 1990, there was an increase of 1 million diagnosed diabetes cases in the United States. So the diabetes increased from a level of about 5.7 million diagnosed cases in 1980 to about 6.7 million cases 10 years later in 1990. However, from 1990 to 2002, the number of diagnosed diabetes cases increased over 7 million to more than 13 million. So in the decade 1980 to 1990, the increase was only 1 million, but in the next 12 years, 1990 to 2002, the increase was 7 million. That's a huge increase. And what was really alarming was between 1996 and 1997, there were 2 million new cases diagnosed in a single year. That's twice as much new cases of diabetes as during the whole decade from 1980 to 1990. And when I began looking at Japanese vital statistics, their public health data, I could see that same big jump between 1996 and 97. I looked at data for New York City. It was in that data, and so I knew it had to be a global environmental event. Now, with cancer, increases in cancer are horrendous in these contaminated regions, but also we have used more and more and more depleted uranium each year, and that big peak increase between 1996 and 97 was when the no-fly zone carpet bombing and grid bombing began in earnest, and of course this was under President Clinton. I think you could call him justifiably a major war criminal. Also, George Herbert Walker Bush and our President George W. Bush. All of these presidents have been responsible for the use of depleted uranium in very, very large amounts, and actually the official admission is much, much, much less than what they've actually used. Now, from official admissions, the atomicity equivalent, or the equal number of radioactive atoms in a gas, is the equivalent of blowing up 400,000 Nagasaki bombs in about 10 years. That is a horrendous global pollution problem. And indeed, by 2003, Iraq was so radioactive that our soldiers, 18 and 19 and 20 years old, sent over there, came back with cancer. And in a unit of 20 soldiers who served in the 2003 Iraq War, 16 months later, 8 of them had malignant cancers. The Centers for Disease Control issued a diabetes warning for children. And this is very interesting because it was June 15th, 2003. This is just after the end of the 2003 Iraq War. And the Centers for Disease Control announced that of all children born in the year 2000 in the United States, that over 30% would have diabetes at some time in their lives. And for blacks and Hispanics, they announced it would be over 50%. That is an astounding number. That is half of your population is going to have diabetes, have an illness at some time in their lives. Well, in 2 articles from Lancet magazine in 2004, November 2004, it's a medical journal, both of these articles state that it had to be an environmental trigger. So we know there are going to be large increases of diabetes, not just in the United States, because this stuff goes everywhere. No one can escape. It's in Australia. It's on the west coast of Tasmania. They're measuring it in the air. It's everywhere. And there's simply, there's no way to escape. These are some maps of diabetes. This is a global map of diabetes, and you can see that the most contaminated area, remember from atmospheric bomb testing in the United States, that happens to be the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And also the North Arctic, which is where the Russians did atmospheric testing and contaminated the whole Arctic, and the birds ate the contaminated vegetation and seeds and berries, and they carried it all over the Arctic and dropped it in their droppings. So they've really contaminated the Arctic very badly. Also, you can see where the Australia and the South Pacific bomb testing was carried by the jet stream around the planet and contaminated the tip of South America and the tip of Africa. Also in Pakistan, India, and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, the monsoons that travel from Australia up in this region across the coast of Southeast Asia transported the radiation to that region. Now, at the other half of the year, the monsoon carries it in the opposite direction from the Middle East across Southeast Asia towards Australia. And so this radiation is being carried back and forth and back and forth. And also the Chinese and the Russians, during their bomb testing in the Gobi Desert in Kazakhstan, did not want to contaminate their own cities. So they waited until the winds were carrying their radioactive fallout towards the Himalayas. And that is the only explanation for such high rates of diabetes in India and Pakistan and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. If you look at Africa, you can see the lowest diabetes rates are in Africa. So if it's an epidemic in the black community in the United States, it's not genetic. Blacks are not predisposed to diabetes. In fact, Dr. Ernest Sternglass and Dr. Jay Gould have discovered in looking at U.S.